Hello, everybody. This is going to be an interesting video, I think. Well, define interest, but this video is going to be about going through a 16 marker potential essay on the discussion of validity and reliability in the diagnosis and classification of schizophrenia. So, in my opinion, the hardest bullet point. What I have done is I've written a 16 marker model answer, or what I think is a model answer, for this question, with the potential view that it is going to come up at some point. This is the hardest, I've said this many times, this is the hardest bullet point across the 2 years, is the first bullet point of schizophrenia. There's so many moving parts to it, and students really struggle to know what's in the AO1 and what's in the AO3. So the question in mind is essentially this. It is discuss reliability and or validity issues in relation to the diagnosis and the classification of schizophrenia. There's a lot of moving parts there. You can talk about the reliability of diagnosis or classification. You can talk about the validity of diagnosis or classification. You can talk about culture bias, gender bias, comorbidity, and it's all about knowing what goes in the AO1 and what goes in the AO3. So handily, what I have done is I've outlined what should go in your AO1 and what should go in your AO3 in a plan right here. So for your AO1, let's have a look. This is really what you should be looking at. Definition of reliability in the context of schizophrenia. So reliability is talking about consistency. You're talking about, is the diagnosis or classification of schizophrenia consistent? We're looking at the DSM, which I don't have on me, annoyingly. Give an example. Like, remember, one of the cheapest ways to get a tick, one of the best ways to get a tick, really, is to give examples about what you are talking about in your AO1. It doesn't have to be kind of research evidence, like Milgram or Rosenhan or things like that. It can be just giving an example, and I've got an example of this in a second. You then want to define validity in the context of schizophrenia. So again, I'll show you an example of this, and then give an example. And then you want to bring in, now I've gone for comorbidity, a definition and a contextualized example, and symptom overlap. You can also add in here culture bias in the context of schizophrenia and gender bias in the context of schizophrenia as well. But I've chosen not to do that because I actually reached kind of 8 ticks before then. What goes in your AO3 though is this. So I've gone for these points. Now, different teachers they have different pieces of advice. They have different philosophies, different ideologies about how many pills you have to put in. I tend to go for my students, I tend to go for 3 points, but more detailed, more elaboration. If your teachers go for 4 pills or even 5, you're going to have to find 2 extra points here, which for this bullet point I think is harder. But the first point I've gone for is evidence of issues. So I'm not going to talk about any pieces of research here at all in the AO1. Not going to talk about any pieces of research. The research, the evidence, the backing up comes in my AO3. So I'm going to give evidence of issues with validity. I'm going to talk about Rosenhan's really, really good piece of research, and to demonstrate that there is issues with validity. My second point is going to be discuss the issues with misdiagnosing, but I'm going to come at it from an economic implications point of view. So essentially what I'm saying here is if we keep misdiagnosing people that don't have schizophrenia and they could go into the real world of work, but we diagnose them with schizophrenia, give them really severe antipsychotics, they have side effects, they can't work. There is an economic implication to that these people who could pay tax, who could produce for the country, who could contribute towards the national economy, all of a sudden they're taken out of that because they're too unwell to work, because the treatments are so severe, treating an illness they didn't have in the first place. And then finally, yes, the DSM is good, and I'll get the DSM maybe at some point in this video. Yes, the DSM is good. However, the idea of standardizing everyone's around the world, everyone's mental health to American norms of mental health completely ignores cultural differences and each culture's symptom pool for schizophrenia. So let's have a look at the A1. I've written down this in A1 form. I will read it out. I'm not sure if that's a great way to spend the video, but here is the A1 I have gone for. So here we go. Um, I think that's enough detail for an A1. And remember, in A1, you're looking for 8 ticks, essentially, right? Eight separate things that you have said that contribute towards the A1. That is a good, it's not the best way, but no, it probably is the best way, actually. It's not 100%, is what I'm trying to say. It probably is the best way to get a broad and deep AO1 is to try get 8 ticks, but you need to understand what constitutes an examiner going kind of tick kind of thing. So let's have a look at this. Reliability in the context of schizophrenia refers to the consistency of both diagnosing and classifying the disorder itself. Now, I would say that's a tick there, personally. For example, considering whether the disorder is considered the same symptomatically across cultures or if there are regional differences in symptoms. And again, I'm just giving examples here. Again, I would say that's probably a tick. On the other hand, validity in the context of schizophrenia refers to the accuracy of both diagnoses and classification. Now, I could elaborate on that a little bit more. I'm probably being slightly generous to give myself a tick there. For example, to what extent are diagnoses of patients accurate, and are there similar disorders that confuse medical professionals? So I've essentially got 4 ticks by outlining the idea of consistency, the idea of accuracy, and then just contextualizing it to schizophrenia as well. Comorbidity, so again, go deeper. Comorbidity refers to the coexistence of multiple disorders within an individual at the same time. The concern with comorbidity would be confusion in classification. And again, I've given myself a tick there. I didn't give myself a tick just for the definition because I think I need a little bit more. But the concern with comorbidity would be the confusion in classification. For example, if a disorder was very often suffered alongside schizophrenia, it may well be that they're the same issue, the same disorder, and thus comorbidity lowers the validity. This is the most important part of the whole bullet point. You need to understand this. What does comorbidity do to the diagnosis or classification, the reliability and validity? What does symptom overlap do to all of that as well? This is the most important part of the entire bullet point, in my opinion, is knowing that comorbidity specifically lowers the validity of the classification. Why? If you're confused about what classification is basically what symptoms go in the DSM. How are we classifying schizophrenia? What is schizophrenia? The reason why comorbidity lowers the validity of the classification is because if depression and schizophrenia keep coming up together, maybe they're actually the same thing. And the symptoms in the book are wrong. So comorbidity lowers the validity of the classification. Furthermore, symptom overlap refers to shared symptoms between certain disorders. And again, remember, this question is about schizophrenia, so specify it to schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder and schizophrenia share several symptoms between them, including mood swings and irritability and depressive symptoms. There's a tick there as well. The presentation of these symptoms to a doctor. So if you go and say, "Doctor, I've got mood swings, irritability, I feel depressed," it may mean that there's an inaccurate diagnosis made because the doctor, you're giving symptoms that appear in several disorders. So in this case, the validity of the diagnoses is reduced due to symptom overlap. And again, I've not put that in there actually, so you could say that. I've also then put here, especially given that schizophrenia does not have exclusive symptoms that are only schizophrenic, which makes it harder to diagnose. So what I really should have done there is saying reducing the validity of diagnoses. Now, what I could have done is I could have, I'm just going to take that out because that goes against what I'm doing here. What I could have done though is I could have gone for gender bias and culture bias. I've left those out, but they are, if you didn't feel that this was enough, you could easily bring them in as well. So I would say that is a model A01. Let's have a look at the A03. So here's the first A03. My point, remember, now I'm starting with in evaluation, signpost to your examiner, right? I'm evaluating, make it obvious to the examiner because some examiners need the signposting. In evaluation, the misdiagnoses of schizophrenia patients has been brilliantly demonstrated before. So I'm basically saying this is research support for the concept that validity of diagnosis is bad. David Rosenhan, what I'm doing here, by the way, firstly, huge adjectives. I think that's adjectives. I'm terrible in English. Describe, throw in description words a lot of the time, right? Good writers do tend to write a lot of kind of descriptive words. But also, just here, I'm just demonstrating to the examiner, like the column, you don't need to know the names, you don't need to know the years, but any kind of additional information that makes the examiner think, yeah, you know a little bit more. Like naming them David Rosenhan, like you clearly know more than the average student. It's just subtle hints that kind of demonstrate to the examiner, this person's done their revision, right? If you can drop a couple of these in, it does get examiners on side. David Rosenhan demonstrated that with standardized hallucination between them, thud, hollow, empty. They all said, though, I keep hearing these words, thud, hollow, empty. Several colleagues tricked their way into 12 different psychiatric hospitals where they were inaccurately diagnosed with schizophrenia despite not having schizophrenia. And importantly, Rosenhan also found that once the incorrect diagnosis had been made, the pseudo patients found it very tricky to remove this sticky label. Essentially, what I'm saying here is the fact that this research demonstrates the poor validity of psychiatric assessments of schizophrenia shows that further work needs to be done by doctors to be able to scientifically and objectively identify a schizophrenic disorder. Therefore, Rosenhan showed that in the 1970s, at least, the diagnosis of schizophrenia was guesswork at best. So this point is essentially saying research support. That's essentially what it is actually saying. So I need to now link this going into my second point. So, second point is this. And start doing this as well. Start highlighting, start linking your peels together. Don't just go, one strength is, one weakness is, one strength is. That's boring, it's formulaic, it's basic, basically, right? Now link your points together. Building on these diagnostic issues I just talked about, inaccurately identifying schizophrenia can have severe and debilitating economic implications. So, you're talking about the diagnoses, but you're linking it from an economic point of view. For example, inaccurately diagnosing people with schizophrenia may mean that the use of antipsychotics makes symptoms worse as they're not actually being used correctly. This would mean that the user is unable to maintain a stable work life, and thus they will not be a productive member of society by producing taxes and contributing to the economy and improving the national productivity rate and all this stuff, right? Link it to schizophrenia because schizophrenia is such a severe disorder. People do generally struggle to work. Not all the time. A lot of the time it's controlled, but if you don't have schizophrenia, but you're being diagnosed with antipsychotics, you probably are not going to be working because the antipsychotics are not going to be treating anything and they're going to hit you for six, basically. Elaboration. Therefore, it's important that psychiatry can actually diagnose schizophrenia through more objective means and be less reliant on subjective judgments made by psychiatrists whose training and experience is not standardized. Therefore, psychiatry may benefit from a stepwise approach of building up to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Maybe diagnose them with a brief psychotic episode, and if they last 6 months, then diagnose them with schizophrenia. That is often done, to be fair, but not all the time. Don't just go bang, schizophrenia, there you go, right, because you may get it wrong. So, again, with my last point, now these first 2 points have been on validity. I want to spread that out a little bit. The next point is going to be on reliability. So, taking us home will be this one just here. Now, I like this point. I like this point. This point is essentially saying the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual created by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, Psychological Association, standardizing the world's mental health to American norms completely ignores the complexity of the symptom pool and culture, basically. So, am I just? Oh, I've got a similar start there, but I've said on top of these diagnostic issues, the attempts by the psychiatric community to standardize mental health completely ignores the power and complexity of culture. For example, using the DSM, which is heavily based upon American mental health norms, it should only realistically be used on the population that the research is conducted on. It should only be used on Americans, but it's not. Go to your doctor, look at his or her shelf, and they will probably have a DSM 5 or an ICD 11 on their shelf. For example, schizophrenia in the US may differ significantly from schizophrenia, for example, in the West Indies, the Caribbean. Um, this ignorance of the cultural influence in mental health ignores the symptom pool, and as a result, classifying schizophrenia to the American view around the world means there will be a host of people who are not being diagnosed with the disorder correctly, and thus they're unable to get treatment for their legitimate illness. Um, there are problems with standardizing what disorders are around the world because not every culture sees um, disorders with the same set of symptoms. For example, in depression in the West, depression is low mood, suicidal thoughts, um, loss of pleasure, anhedonia, um, and maybe intrusive thoughts, kind of thing. In the East, it's a lot of those symptoms, but one of the key symptoms of depression is actually something called choro, the delusion that your genitals are going up inside your body. Now, we think that's weird. We think that's weird, but in sorry, just got that's really thrown me. Someone just came in my room then. We think that's strange, but in Japan, that's a perfectly normal symptom of depression. If you then take American views of depression, just go bang on Japan and go, nope, Koro, that's weird. Anyone with Koro is not now getting treated. And that's a normal thing in Japan. So there are real problems with this. This is probably, I would say, that the best way to tackle this question. If you were someone who felt like you needed to write 4 peels, you do have an additional point to use here of talking about Copeland. Copeland looked at issues with consistency and reliability, basically. So between British psychiatrists and American psychiatrists. That would be the best way I would go about this. You've got these 3 points. So you've got this AO1 just here. Remember, AO1, you want to be talking about validity and reliability ideally, and then as many of the 4 things: comorbidity, symptom overlap, culture, and gender bias. And then you've got AO3, which I think are quite broad, quite nice. Hope this was useful. And I will be doing more of these videos on the harder parts of the specification, certainly.